Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the Keynesian, or perhaps better, the post-Keynesian macroeconomic model, I want to give you a little bit of a historical backdrop to allow us to kind of contextualize and contrast the arguments of Keynes and the post-Keynesians with the neoclassical theories that we've seen previously. We can go back to the 1920s, especially in Britain. At this point, neoclassical theory is dominant amongst academic economic circles as well as many policy circles. This isn't really true outside of Britain and the United States and elsewhere, but even in the United States and elsewhere, neoclassical theory has become much more popular amongst both policymakers as well as academic economists. And the arguments that capitalist economy should naturally and will naturally tend to full employment and prosperity appears to be fairly valid in the 1920s. In the U.S., the stock market is booming, the economy is booming, unemployment is at fairly low levels, below 5%. The self-adjusting economy appears to be working. But by the end of 1929, as you probably know, things start to change. This brings us into starting in 1929 and through the 30s, really all the way up until World War II, the Great Depression, a deep and prolonged recession. We didn't call them recessions at the time, we called them depressions. Later we started calling them recessions because depression was kind of depressing. In the 1930s especially, we saw the financial sector collapse with thousands of banks going out of business. We saw diminished expectations, lower sales, lower investments, lower consumption leading to lower sales, leading to layoffs, leading to lower consumption, leading to lower savings, and a downward spiral that led to this deep and prolonged Great Depression. Of course, for economic theory, people started to ask, what's going on? Why isn't the economy recovering? Where is that self-adjusting mechanism that neoclassical theory tells us is intrinsic to a capitalist system? And really the only answer that neoclassical economics could give is that this depression is a short-run issue. The economy will recover in the long run. But of course that begs the question, how long is that? And this brings us to John Maynard Keynes, an already famous English economist from Cambridge University, the son of a famous English economist who had previously remarked, "In the long run, we're all dead." Now that comment gets brought up periodically and often misunderstood, so it's worth reading the sentence that came after it. Keynes said, "In the long run, we're all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is past, the ocean is flat again." What Keynes was arguing here is that neoclassical economics was not doing anybody a service by saying that the economy will return, will get out of the Great Depression if only we wait for the short-run anomaly to pass. So drawing from these observations previously, Keynes is in the early and mid-1930s writing in the middle of the Great Depression to figure out, one, what was wrong with the neoclassical theory that he had inherited from previous generations of English economists, and to put forward an alternative way of looking at the macroeconomy of capitalism. His treatise, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936, is almost certainly the most important economics text published in the 20th century. In The General Theory, he explains, amongst other things, how the economy could and is likely to, indeed, to settle at a level of output that is less than full employment. He called it the general theory because, according to him, neoclassical theory was a special case. Neoclassical theory, Keynes argued, is true, it holds, it's valid, but only when the economy is already at full employment. His main contribution, then, was to explain why it is that capitalism wouldn't normally be at full employment, in which case neoclassical economics wouldn't normally be relevant. And before getting into the nuts and bolts of the Keynesian arguments and model, I just want to give you the kind of basic arguments, the most overarching view of what Keynes was arguing in the general theory. First, he argued aggregate planned expenditure, which we can just say aggregate demand or total spending. Aggregate demand determines output and income. And here's a bonus question for you. How does this compare to Say's law that we've studied previously? Keynes argued then, second, Aggregates demand is determined by consumption and, more importantly, intended or planned investments from businesses. Another bonus question, how does this compare to the loanable funds market model that we've studied previously as well? Let me give you a moment to think about those two bonus questions before I give you the answers. Okay, here are the answers. First, aggregates planned expenditure, aggregates demand, total spending determines output and employments. What Keynes was arguing is supply doesn't create demand. In fact, demand creates supply. Second, aggregates demand is determined by consumption, but more importantly, investment. What we'll see in a lot more detail later in the term, what Keynes was arguing is that savings don't create the funds necessary to invest. In fact, investment creates the income necessary to save.